Hi y'all, welcome back to my channel, A Year in Books with Zoe. I am Zoe, and today we're going to be looking at my top 10 books from 2022 with 3 honorable mentions. And then I'm going to tell you the books, but they are not in the order of how much I liked them. They're in the order of when I read them, so just as like a disclaimer for the beginning. All right, so one of the very first books that I read this year was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I did see that it's currently available on Kindle Unlimited, so that's something to keep in mind if you have that subscription. And as of when this video comes out, so I mean, if you're watching this at a different time, I don't know. Can't promise that it's still on there. All right, so we have Oliver and then Detective Colborne at the very beginning of the book, and you know, Oliver has just come out of a 10-year prison sentence. Detective Colborne is the one who put him in prison, and he's finally like, what really happened with this murder case that you were arrested for? And so Oliver, knowing that the detective is about to retire, decides that he's going to tell him the true story of what happened. And so that's kind of what we're following. So we're hearing the story from Oliver's perspective, where he talks about when he attended this elite arts college that had a theater program that was Shakespeare only. And there he is one of 7 seniors who live in a house together and are finishing their last year as Shakespeareans at this school. And so the students throughout their time had played characters that were very specific archetypes, and it seems like maybe they presented those to begin with, but by playing these characters, they really become more and more involved with the archetypes and more involved with the drama of Shakespeare. If you're not familiar with Shakespeare, I do have another video about that, about although it's not exactly like about Shakespeare, but there's a lot of drama, a lot of seduction, murder, evil plots. There's a lot going on because they're plays and you want them to be interesting. Anyways, they get really wrapped up in their performances, and it results in one of the 7 dying. And all of a sudden, their life is chaos, and they're trying to figure out who's culpable. And of course, we know already that Oliver takes the blame for this. But we get to see, like, these students aren't really what they seem. The story's not what it seems, and it's really, really fascinating. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was extremely well written. It was interesting to kind of read so much Shakespeare. At the time, I hadn't really looked at Shakespeare all that much, so I wasn't really familiar. So it might be interesting to reread and see if I'm more familiar with the plays that they're talking about and kind of the language of the plays. So there is that. There's a lot of Shakespeare quoting, so if you don't like that, probably skip this one. I was not expecting all the things that happened to happen. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I couldn't put it down. I read this on a plane back to Virginia from Texas. There are some content warnings to be aware of. There's some substance abuse, domestic violence, obviously murder. So just be aware of that before you go into the book. Then we have Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. And so this is a bunch of short stories that Machado has written, and they're super, super fascinating. It's a bunch of different genres. You have science fiction, psychological realism, comedy, horror, fantasy. She's like really exploring what it's like to be a woman and the experience women have on their bodies, especially the violent experience that we have on our bodies. So it's really fascinating to read. And then it's 8 short stories, and they're all really, really good. I remember feeling like really mesmerized by this book, and getting really into it. I didn't expect to be into it, because at the time I hadn't read a lot of short stories, so I didn't know if I was going to like it, and especially with the kind of like science fiction aspect. I'm not a big science fiction person, but I really enjoyed the stories. They're really fascinating, really well written, and like really make you think. For content warnings, there's death, violence, body dysmorphia, body horror, and child death, and there's more as well. All right, and then we have Nightcrawling by Layla Motley. I read this book as an advanced reader copy before it came out. It was a book that came out in 2022, and it was absolutely amazing. So the story follows Kira, who is, maybe it's Kiara, I think it's Kiara, who, you know, has grown up in an apartment complex in East Oakland. She has an older brother, Marcus, but he kind of leaves her behind to go do his rap career, and so her parents are out of the picture. There's like something tragic that happened, but it's not clear exactly what it was at the beginning of the story. That's left them by themselves. So her brother goes to do his rap career. She says like he's not great at it, and so she's forced to figure out how she's gonna pay the bills, how she's gonna keep her apartment. And then that becomes even more stressful when the little boy that lives next door, his mother, who is a drug addict, abandons him, and she's kind of forced to take care of him. And so as she's looking for work, she accidentally prostitutes herself out to a man, and then realizes that this is something that she can do to get money. The only issue is that she eventually gets caught by the police, and then gets involved with sex work for the police, which leads to a case where she is up against the police, which is not a great position for a young Black woman who's a sex worker to be in. And so I thought this book was absolutely phenomenal. I think that it does a really good job of kind of like showing you the life of a sex worker and how like complicated it can be, and also the really vulnerable position that they can be in, especially with law enforcement. I also liked that Motley includes parts where Kiara is really happy and, you know, enjoying her life, that it's not just hardship, although that's an aspect of her life. I think that it was really well written and handled really well as well. And then for content warnings, of course, it's sex work, police violence, child death, substance abuse, sexual violence, suicide, and more. All right. And then we have Dead Collections by Isaac Fellman. So this follows Saul, who is a trans-mask vampire archivist who's forced to hide from the sun and lives in his office in the archives. And so he meets Elsie, who is the grieving widow of one of the creators of this show that Saul really liked when he was younger. And, you know, as they're getting to know each other, they realize that they were both in this fan fiction conversation online. And, you know, they're kind of getting to know each other better. And that's, of course, difficult because Saul's dealing with transphobia from his workplace, trying to figure out where he's going to live and, like, how he's going to exist because of his position as a vampire, and also trying to go through the stigma of vampirism. I absolutely love the story. The book itself is super pretty. Let me show you. Super pretty. Love the cover. It was just like such a good read. I highly, highly recommend it. And the vampirism, like how it works in this story is really interesting as well. And then for content warnings, there's blood, death, transphobia, and more, of course. Then we have Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White. So in this book, an alt-Christian cult has brought about the apocalypse and basically killed like everyone on Earth. And so we're following Benji, who is a trans boy raised in this cult. And he ends up managing to escape, and he has to try to find somewhere to hide, because he has been infected with this like biohazard that makes him very powerful in this world. And then this biohazard has also infected other people, and it reacted very differently in them than it did Benji, and so they become these like monsters that try to kill everybody. And so he ends up finding this group of queer teens at the LGBTQ plus youth center. And so he can kind of start to be accepted there. But there is one character, Nick, who has autism, which is like good representation, who knows Benji's secret. And so, you know, Benji and Nick are both kind of conflicted about that. And so Benji kind of gets involved with them and has to go about doing some things for them. I don't want to like spoil it, so I won't say what exactly. I really love this book. This was the pro-queer, hyper-Christian book that I needed this year. I love a book where the queer kids like rise up against the very like alt-Christian group. I really do recommend it. It is a YA, so be sure to have your young queer kids read it, especially trans kids, because we don't see a lot of representation of them in literature. For our content warnings, we have religious trauma, transphobia, bodily mutilation, body horror, violence, death, and more. Okay, then we have probably one of my hardest reads of the year, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. So this follows Vanessa, who, after being contacted by a woman who had inappropriate sexual advances made on her by her English teacher, she begins to question the relationship she had with said English teacher when she was younger. And so the story kind of flashes back and forth between 2000, when Vanessa and her English teacher, Jacob Strain, are having their relationship. At the time she is in high school. To 2017, where Vanessa is a grown woman kind of trying to deal with this. And she has a lot of pushback about it, because she really views this relationship that she had with her teacher as a consensual relationship, as something that she wanted, that she brought on herself. And so you kind of go along and see that that's not really the truth. This book is really interesting. I really enjoyed it. I think that it can be a good way to work out your own like feelings and thoughts on issues like this, but it could also be pretty harmful. It's hard to read, likely even for people who have not experienced trauma like this. It's deeply upsetting. It's really deeply upsetting. There are things that are just absolutely disgusting that happen in this book. It does have like a hopeful-ish ending, so it's not all doom and gloom, but it's a very tough subject matter, so that's something to be aware of when you go into the book. For your content warnings, you have grooming, adult minor relationship, victim blaming, trauma, and rape. There's a pretty graphic sex scene between the two of them that is, in my opinion, not consensual. So that's just something to be aware of before you read that book. All right. And then we have A Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley. And so I listened to this as an audiobook. I highly recommend the audiobook. It was great. So check that out if you're an audiobook person. So this story follows Adonis Fontaine, who is a biracial woman. Her mother is white and her father is Native American. And so she's kind of on the cusp of her hometown and the Ojibwe reservation, and she doesn't really fit into either one. She does not have recognized tribal status. Yeah, which is complicated. And her uncle dies before this book happens, and she really is trying to like comfort her mother and then her grandmother has like a stroke as well, and so there's a lot going on with her family. And then this new boy, Jamie, moves in and he joins her brother's hockey team, and she kind of starts building a relationship with him. And then as things are kind of starting to calm down for her, getting a little bit more relaxed, she witnesses a pretty violent crime. She witnesses a pretty violent crime committed to someone who's close to her, and gets pulled into this investigation that's happening there where she's living. And so she's kind of like forced to balance protecting her community, her native community specifically, and protecting the culture of her native community. Which is like a really difficult balance. I really love this book. I think it's really well written. I think that the story itself is very interesting, and then I think the issues that come up in the story are also interesting as well, and something that's definitely good to think about. There's like this complicated part of her that is having to, interact with the police in order to protect her community when the police have hurt her community before. And then for content warnings, we have drug abuse, death, gun violence, kidnapping, sexual assault, and more. All right. Then we have In Defense of Witches by Mona Chollet. Chollet examines the history of witches and the way women have been treated throughout history. So she delves into topics such as motherhood, relationships, work, body image, and more. She talks about the type of women who've been accused of witchcraft historically. And then she relates witch hunts to the ongoing misogyny that women experience today. And so that's where she kind of connects motherhood, relationships, body image to the way that women have historically been treated. I thought this book was really thought-provoking, really well written. It made me think about my own experiences as a woman. One thing though I will mention is it does lack experiences of women of color, which I think is a real disadvantage of this book. I would have liked to seen what the experiences of women of color were. And then for content warnings, we have violence against women, child regret, and misogyny, and then more. All right. Then we have Sir Callie and the Champions of Helston by Esme Symes-Smith. So Callie is a non-binary kid who moves away from their mom when their mom is trying to force them to be a girl. So they and their dad move to this little area where there's a bunch of like misfit type people. But their dad gets called back to Helston to help the prince because their dad is a knight. And Callie also wants to be a knight. So Callie decides to follow their father to Helston. The only problem is dad has really made Helston seem great, but Helston is not really accepting of a kid like Callie, who is against the gender norms literally like not falling into the gender norms because they're non-binary. And Callie goes back and ends up having to be forced to pretend to be a girl again, which is really hard, and it's kind of hard to read. This is a middle grade book, by the way. But even having to like pretend to be a girl again, Callie is not deterred. They are determined they're going to be a knight. And they make friends with Elowyn, who is this girl of the castle who is determined to use her magic for more than just pretty, useless things. And Prince William, who is a magic user despite being a boy, which is very taboo in this society. There's a lot of messages of the power of friendship. I know it sounds cheesy, but I love books with the power of friendship. Found family, love that as well. But most importantly, the villain of this story is not the type of villain that you would expect. This is a villain of intolerance. Lord Perrin is so evil because he wants everyone to fall into these strict lines of society. I found myself so angry constantly, but I think it's because a lot of queer kids experience that, a lot of queer adults experience that. And it's just really difficult to read a villain that's not just like a bad guy, but is really similar to villains in real life. And then, of course, we have Mean Baby by Selma Blair. So this is the story of Selma's life. She is a famous actress, a model. Some people might know her as a advocate for people with multiple sclerosis, MS. So she kind of talks about her experiences with other celebrities, words of wisdom from her mother, the darker moments, and how she looks forward with positivity. Her life was really difficult. Her mother was very appearance focused. She started drinking as a child and drank for a very, very long time. A close adult man made like inappropriate romantic advances towards her. She had multiple suicide attempts throughout her life. She gets an eating disorder. She has a lot of like chronic health problems throughout her life that are unexplained until eventually she gets diagnosed with MS. There's a lot of hard stuff going on for her. But she kind of, at least in the book, she shows herself like remaining positive. She's able to reflect on her experiences. And yeah, she's able to like kind of overcome all of that. You know, she talks about celebrities that are her good friends. She was good friends with Carrie Fisher, who also has memoirs that you should definitely check out. She ends up having a son, and I think that's really where her life turns around and she begins to be more positive, more caring about her own self in a way that she wasn't previously. Yeah, and it's so honest and open. It feels like you're talking to someone that you know, a good personal friend, who's telling you about all their experiences. My thoughts are that I really enjoyed this. I did listen to the audiobook, so Selma is reading it herself, which I really enjoyed. She, at times, she's like kind of overcome with emotion, and you can hear it in her voice, which I really appreciate. For content warnings, there's of course mention of suicide attempts, drug abuse, addiction, overdose, sexual assault, eating disorders, and more, of course. All right, and then for my honorable mentions, I'm not going to go into a bunch of details about them. I'll just mention them. I have Starlight Jewel by E.L. Lyons, which came out last year. Hester by Laurie, Lico, Albanese, which also came out last year, and I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. Those books were really good. They just didn't make the top 10 because I read a lot of good books this year. Honestly, I'm surprised that I got to a top 10 so easily because I did read 65 books before, and I feel bad saying that I like some books better than others, but the reality is I just read some books that were way better than the other ones that I read. Not to say that the ones that aren't on this list are bad. But yeah, that is my top 10 books of 2022. And I'm ready to read more. I already finished a book this year, and I'm hoping to finish more soon. Thank you so much for listening. If you've read these books, please tell me your thoughts. If you want to share your top 10s, please do so. I'm always looking for more things to read.